We shall commence this module by discussing about technological advancement. Proliferation of technological advancement has provided impetus to economic growth both in the developed and developing countries. However, it is amply being made clear that the growth that raises economic standards also degrades the quality of environmental goods and services. This is true more for the developing countries. Environmental degradation in developing countries has explicitly reached a stage where the ecosystem's assimilative capacity has given way to higher levels of air and water pollution. It is believed that further expansion of industrial output will inevitably worsen the already higher levels of pollution in these countries. In addition to this, growing global trade and open borders have encouraged many of the world's most severely air and water polluting and waste generating industries to move to developing countries. These countries are termed as pollution havens, where not only the ecological and environmental but human health is compromised with low priority given to environmental issues. However, with growing awareness and concern, the belief that developing countries cannot afford to curb environmental abuse as efficiently and effectively as affluent countries can is eroding. Several research and policy experiments have shown that in recent years, better policy options have evolved in poorer and less developed countries to restore the resilience of ecosystem and save environment. Factories in many low-income countries are now operate more cleanly than they were a decade ago. Pollution havens have failed to materialize. The new policy options known as informal regulation are far more effective and efficient than the conventional policies, that is command and control and economic instruments to tackle pollution problems. After studying this module, you will be able to know about the policy innovations to abate industrial pollution, to know about the evolution of informal regulation, understand the economic model of demand and supply, compare cost bargaining solution and informal regulation. Let us discuss briefly about conventional policy instruments. The conventional instruments are broadly classified as command and control or quantity based and market based or economic instruments. Command and control instruments establish uniform effluent concentration standards and technology standards to be complied by all the firms across all the states. These policies guide firms for their abatement decisions by specifying the enforcement procedures, liability assignments, and penalties for non-compliance. The responsibility of defining and enforcing the standards and other procedures is shared legislatively specified methods between the national, state and local governments. Government investment for paving roads, constructing solid waste dumps to control releases of particulate matter, R&D and clean technology is also one of the pollution control methods. As an example, government investment in cleaner fuel, that is CNG, vehicular technology, that is Euro norms, and metro rail in Delhi in India has led to a considerable reduction in air pollution. Pargal et al. Also find wide variation in enforcement of CAC across states. Market-based instruments include emissions charges, abatement credits, tradable permits, which are explicit or implicit price on emissions. This is more flexible approach as firms get incentives to choose a suitable method to reduce emissions. Moreover, these instruments generate revenue which can be used to support environmental goals. Ellen Blackmell and Winston Harrington argued that implementing suitably modified emissions fee policies provide revenue to be utilized for environmental projects and programs. In addition, indirect instruments like taxes on dirty inputs may be a second best approach to pollution abatement. Worldwide, almost all countries have adopted CSE policies as the primary means of controlling industrial pollution, but these policies are more successful in developed countries due to stronger financial and legal base. In developing countries, the performance of conventional command and control policies is undermined due to many reasons. Existence of widespread, difficult to manage small scale industries which lack appropriate production technology, skill and knowledge, resulting in severe pollution in local areas, weak judicial system, inefficient data monitoring institutions, constant financial constraints faced by a regulatory body, relatively high administrative and political costs, and information asymmetries. In spite of formal instruments in place, developing countries still have pressing environmental problems. To solve these problems, constant experiments are being made to evolve innovative, low-cost pollution control strategies that do not depend directly on regulators to issue legal mandates, monitor compliance, and sanction violations. Instead, they seek to provide leverage to local communities, capital markets, and consumers in negotiation with local firms to lower pollution levels. These strategies are termed as informal regulation. The expectation is that these policies will complement formal regulation and eliminate the dominance of institutional and political machinery that have undermined the performance of CSE policies in the developing countries. Now, we will move on to understand the informal regulation, new approaches to win the old battle. Informal regulation is a strategy wherein communities pursue levels of environmental quality which are desirable and feasible in local conditions for their self-interest. These programs have been touted as a means of circumventing perhaps the most daunting obstacle to pollution control in developing countries, the weak environmental regulatory institutions. The best known forms of informal regulation consist of community pressure, public disclosure, information dissemination and rating. Community pressure. Community pressure is one of the important elements of informal regulation. It can include the demand for monetary compensation, firms' closure through social ostracism of the firm's employees, boycotting the firm's products, even threat of physical violence. Implicitly, such actions explain communities' property rights to environmental resources. It forces the polluting firm to take corrective actions to abate the pollution. Even regulatory standards and institutions can be used as formal channels for informal regulation. Local groups can report the violation of environmental standards by firms to the formal regulators. Community pressure thus works like a countervailing force which can use formal regulatory body to help tightening local monitoring of environmental standards, enforcing environmental policies, and even publicizing firms' emissions. The role of formal channels thus changes from a dictator to a mediator. However, the violation of legal standards can be reported only if information on standards is widespread and violators are easily identifiable. It is well known, particularly in developing countries, that regulators' resources are limited and legal proceedings are costlier. As a result, many regulatory violations are either undetected or lightly penalized. In developed countries, Informal regulation may prove to be more effective because they have greater preference for environmental quality, more awareness of pollution risks, and are better equipped to exert political, social, and economic pressures. Public education. Education would generate more awareness among the masses for their rights to clean environment. Once aware of the sources of pollution and its impacts on human health and ecology, poor citizens can exercise their voting rights to elect those leaders who use the powers of formal regulation to complement informal regulation channels. Public disclosure program. Public disclosure programs, also known as third wave, collect and disseminate information about firms' environmental performance. After command and control and market-based approaches, the third wave is the most popular approach of tackling pollution problems, both in the developed and developing countries. Developing countries, which are characterized by the weak regulatory institutions and limited political will, the public disclosure programs appear to be an effective tool to manage environmental resources. Tittenberg has identified 7 channels through which public disclosure may motivate firms to improve their environmental performance. These channels are clubbed into following broad categories. A. Output market pressures. Disclosure may affect the demand for firms' goods. B. Input market pressures. Disclosure may affect the demand for firms' securities and the firm's ability to hire and retain employees. C. Judicial pressure. Disclosure may encourage citizens to initiate tort law actions against polluters, motivate private suits to force firms to undertake abatement, and give rise to judicial actions in countries whose constitution guarantees citizens the right to a healthy environment. D. Regulatory pressures. Disclosure may build support for new pollution control legislation or better enforcement of existing legislation. E. Community pressures. Disclosure may enhance pressures that community groups and non-environmental organizations place on polluters to cut their discharges. F. Managerial information. Disclosure may provide new information to managers about their plants' discharges and options for reducing them. National public disclosure programs. 2 types of national public disclosure programs have emerged over the past 2 decades. First, pollutant release and transfer registers are systems to collect and disseminate information on environmental releases and transfers of toxic chemicals from industrial and other facilities. They were established in several countries after 1984 Bhopal disaster and 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro, which affirmed the right to know of communities and workers about toxic chemicals and other substances of concern. PRTPs are type of emission inventories typically containing data on emissions to the environment from individual industrial facilities. Second, rating system wherein database of polluting firms is created and the information is used to rate the firm's environmental performance. In developing countries, these programs focus mostly on conventional pollutants. Examples include Indonesia's program for pollution control, evaluation and rating, known as PRO-PER, India's Green Rating Project, Philippines' EcoWatch program, China's Green Watch program, and Vietnam's Black and Green Books initiative. Green Rating Project. the Green Rating Project, that is JRP, of India is one of the very few public disclosure projects in the world in which a non-governmental, non-industry organization rates the environmental performance of industries and makes the results public. Under JRP, factories are classified according to their emission levels and broadcast the result widely to enable communities to identify serious polluters. Based on the available information, communities can pressurize polluters to take appropriate actions to clean up. In India, industries assessed under the JRP project are awarded leaves for their performance, the highest being 5 leaves and the lowest being none. Further, the Environment Ministry has proposed to classify various industrial sectors across India under a 3-colored red, orange and green scheme depending on their pollution potential. Public disclosure does not necessarily require an effective enforcement capability or even a well-defined set of environmental regulations. Moreover, administrative costs, data collection and dissemination are low due to widespread application of information technology. Next, we shall learn about the economic model of informal regulations, the demand and supply equilibrium. A firm's demand for environmental services is reflected by its marginal abatement cost schedule. Since firms use the assimilative capacity of environment to discharge their effluents for emissions, their demand for environmental services would reduce as these firms increase their efforts or investment for adopting the pollution control and prevention activities. Abatement costs are negatively related with emission levels, implying that the more a firm abates, the lesser it requires the environmental services. Moreover, it becomes progressively expensive for the plant to abate at low levels of pollution due to diminishing marginal returns. The supply of environmental services to a firm is reflected by the marginal social damage schedule. Hartman et al. Argued that in the absence of an effective regulatory system, the local community would confront with polluting firms for their own rights to local environmental resources. Community would assess the MSD by monitoring pollution levels, assessing the damage and bargaining to enforce local pollution norms. The assessed MSD reflects the locally enforceable supply schedule. The supply curve slopes upward, implying that there is a positive relationship between environmental damage and the cost, that is, penalties imposed on the polluting firm. Costs would increase progressively as the firm uses more units of environmental services, that is, to discharge its emissions or pollutants. Penalties, either pecuniary or non-pecuniary, are imposed on the polluting firms by local communities, regulators, courts, employees, capital markets and consumers in the absence of effective formal regulation. The equilibrium pollution level in the local area is determined at the point where the demand and supply schedules intersect, as has been shown in the following diagram. Shows the firm's choice of emission levels. This figure can be used to show the impact of environmental policy innovation on the firm's level of pollution. For example, implementation of the public disclosure program may result in reducing firm's equilibrium emission level from Q to Q1 by shifting the marginal damage schedule from MSD0 to MSD1. Public disclosure program affects the firm's actions by making local communities aware of the firm's increasing levels of emissions and accordingly rise in penalties on every unit of emission. These actions may lead the profit maximizing firms to reduce pollution to the point where the marginal cost of abatement equals the expected marginal penalty for compliance. Let us now discuss the informal regulation and cause solution. Informal regulation is considered to be an extension of causes approach of internalizing the externalities. Both of these methods rely on negotiations taking place among the affected parties for their rights to having a good environmental quality. However, causes solution includes the limited number of participants into the bargaining process, whereas informal regulation includes the larger number of participants, that is local communities, consumers, capital market, etc. Also, causes efficient outcome can be achieved even in the absence of a regulatory agency if information about the externality is clearly known. Property rights are delineated and a well-defined legal system exists. But informal regulation, that is community pressure, would affect polluters' behavior even in the absence of accurate information, explicitly defined environment property rights and a legal system to adjudicate settlements. But informal regulation, that is community pressure, would affect polluters' behavior even in the absence of accurate information, explicitly defined environment property rights and a legal system to adjudicate settlements. Informal regulation has emerged as a powerful tool for controlling pollution even in the countries where there is no dearth of information, legal system is effective and property rights are explicitly defined. In developing countries, in principle, the regulator has an array of physical, legal, monetary and other instruments at his disposal, but studies in India have concluded that despite a strong legal framework and the existence of a large bureaucracy to manage environmental regulation, its implementation is very weak. Now, we will summarize what we have discussed in this module. Under formal regulation, government institutions enforce uniform standard setting even in countries with great variations in geography and levels of industry concentration for controlling industrial pollution. However, a growing body of evidence from developing countries suggests that regulatory system might well have the edge in priority setting, monitoring and enforcement. Under informal regulation, communities tend to focus on visible pollution whose impact is immediate and obvious, as they have limited avenues of self-defense and know very little about long-term risks of pollution exposure. The advantage of informal regulation over formal regulation is that the former includes people's perception about local pollution problems, which is expected to be more accurate. This would help obtaining a pattern of shadow pricing for local environmental resources. Constant researches and innovations have established new methods for controlling industrial pollution, which are transparent and information intensive. Stakeholders now view environmental regulatory agencies as a support, not a dictator. Community representatives, along with regulators and factory managers, negotiate on the relevant issues. Market agents, including financial institutions, stockholders, and consumers who decide their own consumption pattern, also influence the decisions of polluting firms. Since each system has clear advantages and disadvantages, the optimal system may be a mixed one. In such a system, the government agencies might concentrate on monitoring, inspection, risk analysis, and dissemination of information to local communities. Local communities could be empowered to meet their own standard using the government agency for legal support and enforcement wherever necessary.